to the dollar doubles and the price of oil in USD doubles, the number of rubles you're getting doesn't actually change, which is a problem because most of your costs are usually paid in terms of your wages or your workers or your stuff that's happening inside Russia. That's all denominated in rubles. And it's not like you get to adjust people's salary down just to account for the fact that you're not bringing in as much from your import contracts. There's a lot more detail I could go into here, but the point of the matter is that the focus on the value of the ruble is, I think, a little bit misplaced. It's not the best health indicator of the Russian economy, especially since the ruble is so shaped by government intervention, by restrictions on trade, and by the changing Russian trade balance, that focusing on just ruble going up is good, ruble going down is bad, sort of misses the wider picture. Anyway, I just wanted to deal with that for a minute. Let's go talk about the other sort of major sanctions. Restricting imports into Russia, restricting the things that other countries are allowed to ship to Russia. And here I think the story is very different with the energy sanctions. If the energy sanctions basically haven't done much in order to prevent Russia realizing massive financial windfalls, there's every indication that restrictions on what countries ship to Russia are having a significant impact on everything from Russian productivity to Russian inflation to Russian employment figures. So countries have basically imposed restrictions on the goods and services that can go into Russia. You can't ship chips and software and dual-use services into Russia. Anything that could be used to support a war effort can't go. And indeed, a lot of companies and countries have gone further and basically don't ship anything to Russia full stop at the moment. The global compliance with these sort of sanctions is far, far higher than it is with energy sanctions. So, for example, whereas countries that aren't party to the Russia sanctions are generally still buying Russian oil, their companies aren't generally selling electronics and chips into the Russian market because they're worried about Western powers like the United States sanctioning them in turn for supporting Russia in some way. It's also been more effective because there's lots of vulnerabilities across the Russian supply chain. Russia does depend very highly on imported goods and services. It relies on high technology equipment from abroad in order to do everything from manufacture cars to manufacture military equipment to dig out hydrocarbon assets and expand its economy. When Taiwan says that Russia can't get any chips from them that are more modern than the sort of stuff you would have seen in the 1990s, Russia can't just magic up a semiconductor industry capable of producing the most capable modern semiconductors overnight. There's limited options. And while you can go steal washing machines and rip the electronics out of them, that's not a solution on an industrial scale. Which is a good chance for us to talk about India and China and sanctions, because they've been in completely different ends of the spectrum when you look at these two different classes of sanctions. The first thing to say is I see a lot of comments that are basically like India and China are with Russia. I do watch a fair amount of Russian state TV extracts and I read a lot of Telegram, and there is generally a feeling that, or a claim that in some way China and India are with Russia, at least economically. My answer to that is no. They're also not with the West, per se. Economically, in both cases, pragmatism seems to have been the go. Both India and China, but particularly India, are buying much greater quantities of Russian oil than before. India is purchasing much more Russian oil than before, and Indian refiners are doing great business buying Russian oil, refining it, and then selling refined Indian petroleum products potentially into the European market. But they're buying it at a discount. They're not exactly giving Russia mates rates. They're seeing that Russia is desperate, and they're taking the opportunity to buy lots of discounted energy. And the Americans and the Europeans have admitted that they would like India and China to stop purchasing Russian energy, but there's nothing in the current sanctions regime that prevents them doing so. So at the end of the day, these countries are entirely within their rights to continue purchasing Russian energy at a discount. Sri Lanka has said that they're open to increasing their purchases of discounted Russian oil. And you have to forgive them. If you're a country in the middle of an economic meltdown, it's easy to understand why they would be willing to buy discounted Russian energy rather than full price oil on the global market. But the opposite is true on the other end when you talk about exports to Russia. The biggest exporter, according to the Congressional Research Service, of high-tech goods, semiconductors, electronics, and things like that to Russia is not the West, it's China. And yet, despite the Chinese government urging companies not to be dissuaded from trading with Russia, major Chinese companies have ceased their trade into Russia. Whereas these countries are happy to continue buying oil, they're not willing to sell their high-tech goods like semiconductors and whatnot into Russia. And this is where the pragmatism comes in. When it comes to energy, these countries are highly dependent on continued supply of preferably affordable oil, especially in their current economic circumstances, and oil is a hard good to replace. And Russia is a major supplier that is difficult to replace. So it makes sense to continue buying the oil and tell the Americans to rack off. But when it comes to electronics, sales into Russia only account for about 2% of China's technology exports. The big market for Chinese technology firms is the West. It's when you buy your discounted laptops, your discounted components. It's when you see made in China stamped on just about everything that you buy. Well, they don't want to lose that market. The companies don't want to lose that market, and they're aware that there is a danger that they do lose the American and the European markets if they continue to trade with Russia. So why would you risk 90% of your profitability in exchange for continuing with 2% of your trade? So it's pragmatism. Because Russian energy is important to them, they'll continue buying Russian energy. Because trade into Russia isn't important to them and trade into the West in electronics is, they'll cease trading with Russia, or at least their private companies will not do so willingly. I mean, think about it this way for a moment. Let's just say you're running a casino and you've got a high-rolling VIP who routinely drops $100 million US on your tables every quarter, and he comes up and starts complaining because he's got a problem with one of your dealers and he's demanding a whole bunch of stuff. Well, even if he's completely in the wrong, you're going to think of that $100 million US, and you're probably going to, discipline that dealer in front of him, get him some free drinks, some free accommodation. You're going to do everything in your power to keep him gambling at your casino. But if a bloke playing the 10-cent pokies downstairs has a problem with one of your security guards and starts making demands, well, you're probably just going to have him quietly escorted outside. That's kind of what's happening here. In the energy market, Russia's the high roller. India and China have every incentive to do what it takes to keep the supply of cheap energy flowing. Emphasis there on cheap. But when it comes to the electronics as an export destination, for example, Chinese electronics companies, Vladimir Vladimirovich is the bloke putting his pension money into the 20-cent slot machine. They can kind of do without him. Because if you want to make a fortune selling high-priced consumer electronics, you're selling that to the Europeans and the Americans. So these sort of sanctions, cutting off high technology imports and indeed medium and low technology imports into Russia, these have already had an immediate industrial impact. Russia is deeply reliant, as I've said, on imported technology, components, services. Russia has made efforts to indigenize some of its defense industry, although it hasn't done so really that successfully. But there's been very little effort to indigenize the civilian economy, which means industrial production is in a lot of trouble as it tries to rekey to what it can do without foreign supplies. I've got a picture here of the Lada Granta. This is a car that Lada has put into production. It claims to be a sanction-busting car, and it's a car that they can produce without the Western components and foreign components that they are no longer able to import. It looks okay, and also the price is definitely going to be right. It's cheaper than other cars. And then you look at the list of features. It doesn't have ABS brakes, doesn't have airbags, doesn't have seatbelt pretensioners, doesn't have a GPS system. It doesn't have any of the critical safety systems or electronics or features that you would expect in a car. Now, I imagine this would be fine because, of course, it's not like the roads in Russia are unsafe or anything. No one's ever seen any dashcam footage of some Mad Max shit going down on Russian roads. I mean, basically, it's the perfect car for someone who has rotated back from the Ukrainian front and has decided they really miss the adrenaline high of feeling like they take their life into their hands every time they drive their vehicle out onto the road. But this is a symbol of the sort of problems that Russia is going to be facing. Because it lacks so much in terms of indigenous high technology performance, it has to fall back on machine tooling and expertise that exists from, in some cases, the early 2000s or the 90s, or indeed in some cases, machine tooling and assets that date back to the days of the Soviet Union. So production in these areas is likely to fall heavily. Sales of cars has cratered by something like 80%. And over time, as you're unable to bring in replacements for certain components, so you run out of inventory, you're unable to recapitalize because you can't buy in new machinery, you can't buy in spare parts or tools, and your productive capacity starts to run down and wear down, expect to see Russian industrial production and the civilian economy really start to suffer. One interesting thing to watch will be Russian military production, because one thing we have noticed from deconstruction of Russian drones and military components that have been captured or recovered in Ukraine is that you encounter things like French thermal images, chips that were made in the United States, goods that have been exported out of the European Union or the West in the past. And it remains to be seen how easily Russia will be able to retool in order to produce this sort of equipment using just indigenous Russian components. And even if they can find a Russian component to do the job, is the productive capacity and human capital there to ramp up production quickly? This is why people question whether Russia's going to be able to replace many of the precision-guided munitions that it has lost. Russia is entirely capable of producing a near infinite number of 152mm artillery shells. They're very good at it. They're the best in the world, and they have warehouses upon warehouses upon warehouses of the things sitting around. But Kalibr is a little more complicated, and if you can't replace some of the Western components, we're not sure what the long-term productivity scenario is. So the natural flow on of this is that while the Russian government's fiscal revenues from energy are pretty safe, they've actually gone up, the private sector in Russia is extremely vulnerable under sanctions. The Russian budget is heavily dependent on energy revenues, but the wider national economy is a little more diverse than just the energy sector. The biggest employer of Russians is actually the service sector. People are acting as retail staff or providing services. And many critical goods and services that allow them to do their jobs, those things are imported. When you see shops shuttered in malls, it's not just that there are fewer goods to buy, it's there's fewer jobs for the people who used to work in those stores, or in the supply chain for those stores, or in the administration of the organizations that own those stores. The cascading effect on unemployment is real. And other parts of the civilian sector are also vulnerable just in the components. Aviation is the biggest example. Yes, they've taken over a whole bunch of aircraft that were leased to them. But with no foreign parts from Airbus or Boeing or the major producers and no assistance in international servicing, how long can they keep those things flying? So as a result, we've seen 17% annual inflation, 8 to 9% fall in retail trade already, 80% plus fall in car sales, and there are wide-ranging estimates on how much Russian GDP is going to fall. The essence here is that the consumer economy, let's forget about the military-industrial economy for a moment. The economy of regular Russians is suffering quite badly. Consumer-driven demand is critical in every market. China has been trying to foster it. In the West, it's basically the critical component of economic activity. And in Russia, what we've seen is that the decline in consumer activity is sort of akin to the worst days of the pandemic, if you want to put it into perspective. Consumer confidence, consumption, those are collapsing. And data lags a couple of months here. The sort of information we have is from May, and there's no reason to think that it has turned around since then. So unemployment and things like that are a going concern in the future. Russian estimates range on how significant an increase they suggest, but there are some stats that we can pull now. And those are the stats on poverty and what this war so far has meant from the average Russian. And here, to avoid criticism, I'm using the Rosstat numbers. I'm using the Federal State Statistics Services numbers from Russia. And normally you wouldn't just take Russian figures as honest, but I'm going to here because they tell enough of the story even if you assume that they've been altered. In the 3 months, from the start of 2022 to the 31st of March, 8.5 million Russians, 5.8% of the population, fell into poverty. They previously weren't in poverty and now are. Now, in their reporting, the Russian Rosstat service tried to basically reduce this figure or make it seem unimportant by saying that since Q1 2021, the increase has only been about 100,000 people. But Q1 2021 was the worst part of the coronavirus pandemic for Russia. It was the absolute pits. So what we're saying is that in less than 3 months, in fact, at that point, in less than a month and a half, the war and the sanctions wiped out Russia's entire COVID recovery when it came to lifting its most vulnerable people out of poverty. It's pretty chilling stuff for a nation that isn't officially at war. And the issue for people like this now is that there's a consumer consumption cliff. If people's incomes are eaten up by inflation and if unemployment rises, their ability to spend in the market decreases, which reduces the impetus for businesses to sell goods and employ people, which causes more unemployment and declining spending power, and you end up in that classic downward spiral. Russia is an economy of deep divides between the rich and the poor. And so far, it seems that this crisis may only make that problem worse. So I guess my prognosis of where Russia is now is that there are really two economies going on. The Russian central bank and the government, their interventions have stabilized the currency. In fact, they may have over-stabilized the currency and overvalued the ruble. Government finances actually look pretty good. There is increasing deficit spending because the increase in oil and gas prices can't overcome the massive increases in expenditure elsewhere, but the deficit does seem to be sustainable. The Russian government is capable of going on for some time, buoyed by this energy revenue. The civilian economy, the private sector, they're in worse shape, worse outlook. It's ordinary Russians that are going to be feeling this a lot more than the government and the defense sector. So where to from here for Russia? My takeaway here is that Russia can afford the war for now. All these people that are saying that the Russian economy is going to collapse tomorrow, Russia cannot afford to continue this war, I am sorry, but economies don't work like that. Industrial nations do not collapse that quickly. Russia can continue this war effort in financial terms for some time. Their economy is projected to shrink depending on who you listen to, somewhere between 5 and 15% this year. There are estimates that are higher, but I'm using 5% as the lowest because that's what Peskov, Putin's press secretary, said. So let's take that as a lower bound. The upper limit of what the Russian central bank is predicting is 15%. They're saying that 15% of GDP is endangered or threatened by sanctions in 2022. The real figure at this stage looks like it's going to land somewhere between it, which is basically an incredibly deep and sudden recession. Like, that's a really traumatic loss of GDP for a large economy. The pain, however, is weighted towards the future. The worst parts of GDP contraction will happen in the second half of this year, and the real pain, particularly once the energy transition starts to kick in, the real pain happens in 2023 and beyond. The issues of restricting Russian exports, energy exports, those have hurt Russia a bit in terms of requiring it to reduce production a bit and sell oil at a discount, but it's been more than compensated for by the fact that prices have spiked, meaning Russia's earning more for the stuff that it is selling, even with the discounts and the other factors. The import restrictions and capital flight, however, are really damaging. It's difficult to see how Russian industry will thrive under circumstances where it cannot bring in semiconductors or critical components from the West, or indeed increasingly even from China and other parts of the world that you would generally think of as more aligned with Russia. The consumer economy and the industrial sector are sort of on the clock in this respect. It's difficult for them to recapitalize, to buy more equipment, to retool, to expand and adapt if they have no access to foreign capital and no access to foreign equipment. My question is, does Putin care? Because all these threats here, these are threats to the living standards of ordinary Russians. They're not a threat to the ability of the Russian military-industrial complex to carry on the war for now. So the question basically is, does the Russian executive care enough about the reductions in the living standards of the Russian population to stop its war, or will it take a lot more pain before they reach that point? All right, so that's Russia. Let's talk about Ukraine. And to be frank, Ukraine is hurting really badly. The World Bank's still projecting that Ukraine will lose about 45% of its GDP this year. And for a comparison, that's about akin to what the USSR lost in the first year, basically, of the German invasion. The USSR lost swaths of territory, millions of men. It had to move its factories brick by brick behind the Ural Mountains. And the result was something like a 45% loss of economic activity. There are some upward revisions in Ukrainian GDP contraction figures now, mostly because it seems like Kyiv and the western part of the country aren't going to be under threat, but those numbers are still pretty dire. I mean, it makes sense when considering the fact that more than 10% of the population has just left. In terms of other measures, inflation is a little bit higher than Russia, but it's in the same ballpark so far as the increase in the cost of living. Borrowing costs for non-guaranteed debt, they're pretty high. They're rated about CCC or worst. The key there is non-guaranteed debt that the Ukraine is borrowing without some foreign party guaranteeing repayment. And the Ukrainian economy has lost something like 5 million jobs according to the International Labour Organization. And that makes sense because you've got about 5 million refugees who have left. Mobilization is pushing potentially as many as 1 million former workers into uniform rather than in their civilian jobs. A number of territories which accounted for a lot of jobs, those have been occupied by Russia, so they obviously no longer count towards Ukrainian employment figures. And there have been shutdowns in business as a result of, wartime disruption. The result is that Ukraine looks a lot more like a wartime economy than Russia. Russia looks like a civilian economy under sanctions Ukraine looks like a wartime economy, with a significant shift of workers into uniform, a major reduction in total population due to refugee numbers, and as a result, a complete